Our atmosphere has been around for millions of years.
You're starting to see a whole lot more folks taking interest in this issue.
It's different than it was 20 years ago.
You can't tell somebody what to think. You can just provide them with the facts.
I've got 2 children. What will their future be?
Well, I started studying climate change in the late 70s and as an undergraduate in college. And by the time I had gotten my PhD, I was aware that this issue was pretty serious.
We are coming to understand much better than we did even a few decades ago how ecosystems are organized and how life can adapt to a water-stressed environment.
Into the 90s is when we really started to see the signs of global warming become clear. And our models also, computer models, were also getting sophisticated enough to get a decent view into the future. And at that time, I really started to say, holy cow, these changes are bigger and faster than changes we had in the paleoclimatic record. The impacts can be huge.
Well, we know that climate change is going to have a significant impact on wildlife and resources, everything from their food sources to water supply and to habitat.
But now everybody's starting to realize there's only a given volume of water. They know that, and every time we've got need that's brought up, challenges and technology starts moving its wheels. People start thinking about it instead of just fighting for a given amount.
Climate change is accelerating. It's pretty clear in just looking at global temperatures. It's even more clear if you start looking at temperatures at high latitudes where we have the biggest temperature increases and the biggest impacts of the temperature increase. Melting sea ice, melting permafrost, melting ice sheets and glaciers. All of this seems to be accelerating.
And so integrating that into just the general mindset of people, it's different than it was 20 years ago.
There are several species we know about that are particularly vulnerable to both the quantity and quality of water in New Mexico. We can think of a couple of obvious examples that are already managed by the federal government under the Endangered Species Act. Water management in New Mexico is already constrained by the legal need to protect the silvery minnow in the Rio Grande.
We've withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol process, and none of the bills are moving through Congress to start a mandatory greenhouse gas reduction program. So you're really seeing a lot more action now in the states, and with governors taking the lead, setting targets, putting programs in place, getting all the stakeholders together to start figuring out how we're going to address this problem. And I think, hopefully that will lead to a groundswell of support for a national program. But in the meantime, people should know that state governors are starting to fill this leadership void that's being left at the national level.
My pleasure to ask you to help me welcome
Professor of Geosciences and a Professor of Atmospheric Sciences.
Professor in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences.
Senior Vice President with the Chicago Climate Exchange.
Investigating paleo-environmental perspectives for the future.
The ways in which human systems interact with water.
Not only economically, but environmentally.
Geohydrology, Greenhouse Reduction and Trading Program.
Any other questions?
Welcome to the 4th Annual Drought Summit. I signed an executive order to inventory existing greenhouse gas emissions in New Mexico and to develop recommendations to decrease New Mexico's contribution to global warming. Clearly, our water resources are facing some very serious challenges. Several of today's speakers will also talk about solutions to the threat of global climate change. This includes the work New Mexico is undertaking through the Chicago Climate Exchange to reduce our state government emissions. I'm proud that we're the first state in the nation to join CCX. The scientists agree climate change is real and we must act now to protect our water supplies for future generations.
Okay, now I want to turn to the Arctic, because I mentioned before that change is going on much faster than we as scientists thought possible. And this really worries people like me, who works in the Arctic, but also thinks a lot about the global implications of Arctic climate change. If you look at the big gorilla of the Arctic, it's the Greenland ice sheet. And this is where we start thinking about how the Arctic change could really have an impact on the rest of the world. When you take water out of the ice sheet, where does it go? It goes in the ocean, and it raises the global sea level. And if you look at this ice sheet, there are really astounding signs of change. We've seen just since '79, when we first could measure the height of the ice sheet with satellites, to 2002, a 16% increase in the area of the ice sheet, shown in this pink color, melting. Since then, 2005, this area of melt has gone all the way up to the crest of Greenland, in southern Greenland, and extends all the way around the ice sheet. This is big stuff. There are a lot more earthquakes under the ice sheet now, because the bottom of this ice sheet, all this meltwater is actually draining through the ice sheet to the bed of the ice sheet and is lubricating that bed, and the whole Greenland ice sheet, not all of it everywhere, but a lot of parts of it are starting to move. Yeah, I mean, there's some big solutions that involve big money. A colleague of mine at the University of Arizona has come up with the idea that we could place a big sunshade in space between the Earth and the sun. And he estimates this would cost about $1 trillion or $2. So it would cost a lot more than maybe trying to stop the problem from occurring. The other thing that this proposed solution misses out on is that the CO2 in the atmosphere is not just causing climate change, it's also causing an acidification of the world's ocean, which will prevent or at least slow the ability of marine organisms to secrete calcium carbonate or aragonite. So you can think corals, plankton, that are the base of the food chain. A lot of organisms would be impacted in the ocean, and this is already happening, and this problem is as big as climate change. So any solution that just works on the climate aspects won't necessarily help with the other issues that we're causing with emissions of greenhouse gases.
Here in New Mexico, we've been measuring snow since the 1930s. So we have some 700 snowtail sites, and these are automated sites that report on a daily basis.
We have right now probably around 180, a little bit less than 200 gauging stations that we're operating throughout the state, and a lot of them are used for compacts and water supply monitoring. The timing of the runoff is just earlier. In New Mexico, it's 5 to 8 days earlier, whereas the Sierra Nevadas, it's up to 20 days earlier. I guess that's attributed to temperature.
In the time that I've been doing it, and I've been doing it about 15 years, we've seen some record low snowpacks in that time frame.
Because of the drought, also, we had a pinyon bark beetle epidemic a couple of years ago that killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.1 million acres of pinyon trees in New Mexico and Arizona.
Typically, you'll see on a live green tree, you'll see small pitch tubes of where the tree's been trying to pitch them out already. And then as the beetles take more effect on it, then the tree will start turning lime green. And then soon there'll be red needles. In '03 and '04, it was taken around 3 months for some of these beetles to kill the trees.
And in North America, particularly in the Rocky Mountains, a prolonged drought here has induced the substantial damage brought by our nemesis, the pine bark beetle. I'm sure you all have your pinyon trees that you can remember. It has stretched from New Mexico well into Alaska. In British Columbia, Canada alone, 22 million acres of pine have been devastated by the bark beetle. That's enough wood to supply the entire United States housing market for 2 years.
Well, personally, I love to go camping and hiking and spend time outside. And I think one of the things about climate change that's the absolute scariest to me is that those places that I love might change drastically within my lifetime.
What about the polar bears?
Can we still go fishing?
Who's gonna fix this problem?
What does global warming mean? What about all the glaciers?
My son would tell you that his dad works on reducing global warming and works with business and industry and farmers and ranchers to find ways to make it something that we can do right now and make it economically benefit.
In our business at Swiss Re, we're the world's largest reinsurer. And that means we reinsure insurance companies. We basically handle large losses. So if there are catastrophes around the world, we're involved in helping communities and people rebuild. We see climate change being caused by human activity. Increasing CO2 in the atmosphere is leading to increasing temperatures. Surface temperature of water, surface temperature on land, and melting.
Whatever solution that we come up with has to work in China and India, around the world.
Chicago Climate Exchange is the U.S. operation. We currently have about 30 full-time employees, but we have a number of vendors that serve as emission verifiers. We've got about 15 employees that manage our European Climate Exchange operation.
We think that you have to make the issue commercial. So you have to find a way to get business behind it.
We approach the companies and the governments and the universities, and sometimes they approach us.
Now, emissions are a waste product as we see it. And waste products have cost. You simply don't throw your trash out in the street and hope somebody collects it for you with pay nothing for it. If you recognize the cost of emissions, you can then deal with it commercially through what is called a cap-and-trade mechanism.
Well, a cap-and-trade program is a market-based program. It's been used very effectively in addressing acid rain in the United States. You set a cap of the maximum amount of pollution that can be emitted.
If they come in below that, they can sell the difference. If they're above, they have to buy the difference.
And then you issue tradable permits, so the people who can reduce their emissions at the lowest possible cost do so and can trade and sell their permits to the people who have higher costs of abatement. And so it's a way to keep the costs down of addressing a serious environmental problem.
Well, first it takes a commitment from executives and managers of the company to say, this is an important issue. We believe that we can get a grip on the emissions from our own factories and warehouses and other operations, that we can start to manage those emissions and that we should do that.
If you use water in certain ways, you can use it 7 or 8 times. You know, our average California, before it ever gets to my city, it's gone through people 7 times. In the city, out the sewage treatment plant, back in the creek, for the fish, back up, back through the creek, down. The time we get it, we use it in San Francisco. Uses it again.
What we're seeing now is the beginning of that transformation, the beginning of a whole new way of engaging ourselves and our economy with the natural world that sustains everything that we see around us.
We recently announced that we are encouraging our employees to adopt renewable energy through our COU2 program. Under this program, we will provide to any employee who qualifies a payment of 5,000 Swiss francs, that's approximately $4,000. That's for employees who will then convert to clean energy and reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. So eligible projects for this would be the purchase of a hybrid car, solar panels or heat pumps, or even paid days off for participating in climate-related volunteer activities.
If you do continuous low or no-till agriculture, you do reforestation projects, you do certain kinds of renewable energy projects, you will get credits. That's a $10,000 check. If you're a dairyman in Minnesota, you make $50,000, $70,000 a year, that's a big boost to your income, to your bottom line.
There are a lot of companies who have already reduced their emissions significantly and found that they could do it at a profit. And that is possible because what they are doing first is energy efficiency. And that is both good for the environment and good for the bottom line.
And these days you could probably live off the grid using solar power, wind power, and back it up with a generator if you needed to that ran on ethanol. The limiting factor would be water.
had a wake-up call in 76, 77 where we just didn't have any rain or snowpack. And we had to put pipelines across major, gigantic bridges just to get cities water. And we had to put little washers on everybody in Marin County. They had to put a little washer where you could only suck so much water through in your house each day. So we went into critical conservation.
The big dam that everybody looks to on the Rio Grande is Elephant Butte. And in the last 5 to 6 years, we've really drawn Elephant Butte down quite a bit just because we aren't able to replenish that water supply because of the low snowpacks we've experienced.
I was just at a recent meeting up in Santa Fe, actually, this summer, and we had a member of the Colorado Supreme Court whose specialty is water. And he pointed out over dinner and things, I pushed him on this. He said, the upper basin isn't going to give up a drop, and there's no way you lower basin states are going to get it. And, you know, I think what he's saying is that there's a train wreck coming, and I think this is why you see California, Arizona, New Mexico, after November, Colorado, are getting very active in the climate change debate, because there is one and only solution to the problem, and that is to stop these things we're talking about from happening.
Because every system's changing. There isn't a river system in the United States that's not changing. New Mexico's changing, climate's changing. California, our estuaries are changing, they're being invaded by invasive plants because of the temperature changes.
I wanted to elaborate very briefly on Peck's comments with regard to Bob's question about fire.
Like I said, some fires can be good and create mosaics, and other fires will rip through an area or smolder in an area, creating what we call a moonscape, which is where everything is killed and it's just gray and black. That's all the shades you see when you get out there.
When you have big swings from wet to dry, you also can enhance the actual amount of fuel available, especially when you have a big pulse of growth in a drought year for plants to die and dry out.
What I'm really worried about on a global scale is we're seeing the same things that are happening down here in New Mexico and across the West are happening in much bigger scale up in the boreal forests of Canada and Eurasia.
I've seen areas like this that have been involved in a catastrophic wildfire, and a reservoir like this going from being full of clean water to being full of mud.
And they're getting lightning on the north slope of Alaska for the first time ever.
So there is every expectation that the extremes that we encounter in weather and climate ought to be somewhat enhanced at both ends, except for the extreme cold end, in a warmer climate. Certainly hydrologic variables ought to become more extreme dryness and punctuated by extremely wet periods or intense storms.
The 2 years with the biggest floods in Arizona have been during the 50s drought and during the current drought last summer.